One evening, Bear the High-Mech Diesel was returning from the works. He had been in there for the last 3 days, having repairs after his torque converter had failed on Christmas Eve. He'd been a bit bored in the works, and was glad to be going home again. James glanced over as Bear backed down into the sheds.
"I'm glad to see you're feeling better,"
he said. "Really?" Bear asked.
"Yes, I was really impressed by what you did on Christmas Eve, Bear,"
James replied. He was the engine who'd been sent to rescue Bear, and had found him struggling along the line with his last-minute Christmas mail, despite what had been a major failure of his transmission system.
"It took that to convince you, James?"
Alice asked. Even though she had seen diesels taking over on the other railway, Alice had never really understood James's prejudice towards them. James glanced down, uncomfortable.
"Well, yes. I won't say too much, but our first encounter with a diesel engine was far from pleasant,"
James said. He knew he had to be diplomatic. After all, the diesel in question was just a few yards away. "Yes, Henry mentioned there was a bit of a history," Bear replied. He frowned a moment later. "One bad apple spoiled it for the rest of us, eh? I can't imagine what he did, but I hope he got what he deserved." An awkward silence fell over the shed for a moment. Then Gordon spoke up.
"Yes, well, all's said and done now. No real point in living in the past."
"Not exactly all said and done," Diesel said. The other engines glanced over at him.
"What do you mean?"
"Well, I've never really apologized for that incident." An angry look crossed Bear's face. "You were the bad apple? What did you do?" "It's a bit of a long story, but there was some dishonesty involved."
"He told the truck's names about us, and framed Stuck for it."
"You did what? What were you thinking?" "Do you really want to know?" "Yes," Bear replied. "I wouldn't mind knowing either," Henry said, and the other engines murmured in agreement. "Very well, I'll tell you. Although if I'm to be completely honest, this story really starts before I came to Sodor." Diesel paused and thought back to his time on the other railway, and those fateful few days on Sodor. Diesel had been working in a small goods yard on the western region of the other railway. The morning had been going smoothly, but that was about to change. As he brought a cut of trucks down the yard, Diesel realized that the siding he'd been planning to use wasn't actually empty. "Driver, stop!" He glared at the trucks, annoyed. "These trucks were supposed to have been picked up 10 minutes ago." The yardmaster came running up. "The engine who's supposed to be taking those trucks has been delayed. He's had trouble getting steam up. You'll just have to use another siding for the moment." Diesel sighed. With another train due to arrive in a few minutes, he needed that siding free. "I guess I'll just find somewhere else to put these," he said, annoyed. Diesel had just shunted the trucks, and was about to get some more when the train he was expecting arrived. "Where do you want these?" asked the Class 40 who was pulling it. It was going to be this siding, but unfortunately a steam engine's been delayed.
I understand. Having trouble getting started, was he?
I believe so, yes. The other diesel chuckled smugly.
Fortunately, we diesels don't suffer from such an unreliable means of propulsion. Just one touch on our starter, and we're good to go.
Diesel couldn't help agreeing with what the Class 40 had said. In fact, he'd often had similar thoughts himself. In the last week alone, he'd had to rescue 2 steam engines who had broken down. He'd seen how long it took steam engines to get ready in the mornings, too. All that fussing about before they could even turn a wheel. Indeed, diesel engines like him were quite revolutionary by comparison. A moment later, a voice broke through Diesel's thoughts.
Diesel, I've got a new assignment for you.
Diesel glanced down, spotting his controller standing next to him.
I've received a request from Sir Topham Hatt, the controller of the Northwest Railway on the island of Sodor. He needs another engine for his yard, and I've decided to send you.
Diesel was dismayed. That's that steam railway, isn't it? With all those old steam engines.
They haven't dieselized yet, no, but you'll be going there tomorrow.
The controller replied, and he strode off. The Class 40 caught sight of Diesel's dismayed expression.
Don't worry about it. Remember, we diesels are far more efficient than steam engines.
Of course, Diesel replied.
I'm sure that once they've seen you, they'll make plans to dieselize their railway. All you have to do is show them how revolutionary we are.
Yes, I take your point, Diesel replied. So, early the next morning, Diesel set out for the island of Sodor. As he made his way along the line, Diesel was lost in thought. To be precise, he was thinking about how he could demonstrate that he and his fellow diesels were far superior to steam engines. He soon crossed the bridge to Sodor, then, shortly after, reached the main sheds at Napford. As he approached the sheds, Diesel spotted a group of steam engines waiting, along with a stout gentleman next to the tracks. Diesel guessed, correctly, that the stout gentleman was Sir Topham Hatt. "Here's Diesel," said the fat controller. "I've agreed to give him a trial. He needs to learn. Please teach him, Duck." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Duck," Diesel purred, as he looked at the small green tank engine he'd been partnered with. He glanced over at the other engines, recalling what his driver had told him about the railway. "And it's James, Gordon and Henry, isn't it? I'm delighted to meet such distinguished engines." Steam engines they may be, he thought, but it wouldn't do any harm to fit in.
Come on,
Duck said.
Let's get started in the yard.
As the 2 engines headed for the yard, Diesel was feeling rather annoyed. How, he thought, was he supposed to show his efficiency if he was partnered with this old-fashioned shunter? To make it worse, this Duck was a Great Western 5700 class, the exact same class of engine that Diesel and his brothers had replaced on the Western region. "Your worthy Sir Topham Hatt thinks I need to learn," Diesel said as they approached the yard. "He is mistaken. We diesels come to a yard and improve it. We are revolutionary." It wasn't just other diesels who shared that view. Diesel had heard some of the workmen on the other railway saying that too.
Oh,
Duck said.
Well, if you're revolutionary, would you mind getting my trucks while I fetch Gordon's coaches?
"Why, certainly," Diesel replied. While Duck continued on to the coach sidings, Diesel backed down to begin his shunting. This was exactly the chance he had been waiting for, to show what he could do. By the time Duck returned, Diesel had arranged a few trucks and was backing down onto some more. These were old trucks, which obviously hadn't been moved in a while. something Diesel would have noticed if he hadn't been so determined to show off. "Come on," Diesel called as he pulled forwards, but the truck's brakes were jammed hard on, and his wheels slipped on the rails.
We can't!
Called the trucks. "Grrr!" Diesel growled, and he strained forwards. The trucks jerked forward, and a crack sounded out. Diesel came to a sudden stop. Duck was chuckling as he backed down onto his train.
Thank you for arranging these, Diesel. I must be going now.
"What? But don't you want these?"
No, thank you.
Diesel gulped. "You mean I did all this for nothing? Why didn't you say something?"
You never asked me. And besides, you were having so much fun being revolutionary, I thought I should leave you to it.
Still chuckling, Duck chuffed off with his train. Silence fell over the yard for a moment. Then the sound of dozens of singing voices filled the air. Anger welled up within Diesel, all of it directed at Duck. There had been absolutely no call for the Great Western engine to embarrass him like this, Diesel thought furiously. He'd only been stating facts when he'd said that his type were revolutionary. This is all that Duck's fault, Diesel muttered to himself as he went to fetch the breakdown train. That steam engine wouldn't have been so quick to laugh if he'd been in Diesel's place. He didn't quite know how, but Diesel was determined to get Duck back. Then he'd see how it felt when the wheel was on the other rail, so to speak. A couple of hours later, Henry had just passed through Marron with some trucks who were bored and wanted some excitement.
Hold back,
the trucks whispered amongst themselves as they approached Gordon's Hill. "Don't you try any of your tricks," Henry said. They ignored him, of course. As Henry began climbing the hill, the trucks started to hold back. Henry struggled up the hill, each chuff getting harder and harder, determined not to let the trucks get the better of him. He was practically crawling when he reached the top, and he was glad the uphill stretch was behind him.
"Now!"
called the lead truck. The trucks pushed forward, and Henry was caught off guard. Henry found himself surging forwards, rapidly picking up speed. "Stop! Stop!" Henry called frantically. His driver applied the brakes, and Henry's wheels locked up. He could only hope as he skidded down the hill. His driver put down sand, but it was no use. After what seemed like ages, Henry skidded to a stop at the bottom of the hill. The alarm was quickly raised. While Edward took away the trucks, Henry's driver and fireman examined him closely. The green engine's driver then stepped round in front of him. "You've got flat tires, Henry." "Flat tires?" Henry asked, confused. "But we engines don't get flat tires. That only happens to cars and lorries and buses like Bertie." "Your drive wheel's locked in place. That skidding stop we had wore them square on the bottom." "But how am I going to get to the works?" Henry asked. He knew he wouldn't be able to run himself on flattened wheels. "We'll have to take you there on a flat car." While this had been going on, Diesel had arrived with the breakdown train. He glanced over. "Having some troubles with the trucks, Henry?" "I'm afraid so," Henry replied. "Yes, they can be rather mischievous," Diesel said, thinking of their singing that morning. As the workmen set to work, Diesel couldn't help thinking about the trucks and how they never missed an opportunity to pay out an engine. The next morning, Diesel was returning from Gordon's Hill. He had just taken some workmen up there to repair the track where Henry had flattened his wheels. It had been overcast all morning, and as Diesel approached the viaduct, the clouds opened up. Rain began pelting down, and above it Diesel could hear the chuffing of an oncoming steam engine. Suddenly Gordon burst through the rain. The express engine was working hard. He'd been delayed leaving Matford, and had to make up for lost time. His boiler and firebox were quite hot, and the raindrops evaporated into wisps of steam as they hit him. "I can see why steam engines were called iron horses," Diesel commented to his driver. When he'd come into view, Gordon had looked just like a racehorse, galloping down the rails.
I think he looked more like a frying sausage, with those wisps of steam coming off his boiler, replied Diesel's driver.
"I suppose so," Diesel said, taking his driver's word for it. To be honest, he wasn't really paying that much attention. He was still trying to figure out how to get even with Duck. A moment later, Diesel realized exactly what his driver had said. "Did you say a sausage, driver?" "Yes," replied his driver. Diesel grinned as an idea came to him. "Oh yes," he said to himself. "That would embarrass Duck indeed." It had a fairly good chance of working too, he thought. After all, Henry, Gordon and James did trust him, and the trucks, as he'd observed yesterday, were always eager to pay out an engine. Now, all he needed was a nickname for James. He would soon have it. Later that afternoon, the rain had eased off a bit. Diesel had just arranged a train for James when the red engine arrived. He was already in a foul mood. He hated taking trucks. But when he saw the length of the waiting train, he was even more annoyed.
"You've made that train too long,"
James complained. "Nonsense. According to the yardmaster, you're capable of taking a few more trucks than this. It's more efficient to run longer trains, to move more trucks at once." An angry look crossed James's face. He wasn't going to be lectured on how to take trains by this newcomer.
"And I suppose it's efficient to have to wait for a helper at Wellsworth, is it?" "What's the matter, James?"
teased one of the trucks.
"Afraid you'll need old Iron's help up the hill?"
That made James even angrier.
"Believe it or not, Diesel, I know what I can handle along the main line. You can forget your precious tractor ratings."
Without another word, James steamed off to take his train. James was just being an old fusspot, Diesel thought. He had expected to encounter some resistance to his way of doing things. What did that tank truck mean by old iron? Diesel asked the trucks he was shunting. The trucks giggled. The way we heard it, James had been calling Edward a load of useless old iron. That changed when James ran away, though. Edward had to chase him down and stop him with a loop of rope over their buffers. "I see," Diesel purred, and he grinned as the last part of his plan fell into place. That must have been what Duck was referring to this morning. He said that if James stayed out in the rain for too long, he'd end up as a load of rusty red scrap iron. The trucks giggled.
"Rusty red scrap iron, that's a good one."
Oh, Duck's got nicknames for Gordon and Henry, too, but he'd never tell you. Just as Diesel was hoping, the trucks fell for it.
Tell us,
they demanded. "Oh, I don't know if I should."
"Go on."
"Gordon looks like a galloping sausage when he goes along the main line, doesn't he? As for Henry, well, you lot made sure old Square Wheels lived up to his nickname yesterday, didn't you?" The trucks started giggling and chatting amongst themselves as Diesel left them at the siding. He couldn't help smirking. That should serve Duck right, he thought. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Well, for Duck and Diesel, anyway. But when James and Gordon came into the yard, the trucks all laughed at them, calling out the nicknames. When Henry returned from the works the next day, the trucks teased him, too. The 3 mainline engines were not amused. The afternoon after Henry had returned, Duck was heading for the sheds. It had been a busy day, and he was looking forward to a bit of a rest before heading out again. But as he approached the shed, he found his way blocked by Henry, Gordon, and James.
Could you move out of the way, please? I'd like to get into the sheds.
We're not moving.
What?
You've been telling jokes about us to the trucks. Old square wheels, am I?
I don't.
Duck was interrupted by James.
And I'm Rusty Red Scrap Iron.
They've been calling me a galloping sausage,
Gordon finished indignantly.
But I never called you any of those things. Then why are the trucks saying that you did? It's
disgraceful.
disgusting.
Despicable.
You three know I'd never.
A chorus of angry whistles interrupted the Great Western engine.
Silence!
Bellowed a familiar voice. All the engines looked down to see the Fat Controller standing next to the turntable. He'd overheard every word of the argument from the Yardmaster's office. It would have been hard not to. He turned to Duck. Did you come up with those names, Duck?
No, sir. I have no idea where they came from. I only wish I had, sir,
he replied, and he glanced pointedly at the other engines. That they would even think he would do such a thing hurt him.
But if the dome fits...
I see, the Fat Controller replied thoughtfully. He then turned to Diesel. Diesel, do you know anything about this? I'm afraid not, sir. No respectable engine would do such a thing, Diesel replied, managing to keep a straight face. He hadn't expected the other engines to react like this. All he'd been hoping for was that they would tease Duck with similar names. But he couldn't really say anything now, he thought. The Fat Controller said nothing for a few moments, then turned back to Duck. Duck, I would like you to go and help Edward at Wellsworth for a few days, while I investigate this.
Yes, sir,
Duck replied sadly. As the Great Western engine shoved off, the Fat Controller turned to the other engines. Henry, Gordon, and James, he began sternly. You, of all engines, should know better than to cause a disturbance like this.
But, sir...
No buts, Gordon. I'm not impressed by your actions here today. In fact, I'm rather disappointed. The Fat Controller finished. He then walked over to Diesel. As for you, Diesel... For a scary moment, Diesel thought he had been found out. I would like to see how you can handle branch line trains. Percy will be arriving to take over the yard later today, and you'll be taking his place on the Farquhar branch. Yes, sir, Diesel said, relieved. A couple of hours later, Percy arrived to take charge of the yard, and Diesel left for the Farquhar branch with the goods train. He had an uneventful journey, and soon reached the yard at Farquhar. He hadn't been there long when a strange, brown engine chuffed in from the quarry. Diesel thought he looked a lot like a garden shed on wheels.
Good morning,
called the other engine.
I'm Toby. You must be Diesel.
That's right.
These trucks I've got are to go out on your next train. It's a slow goods to Dryo. I'll take care of the ones you've just brought in.
Are you sure? Yard work is my forte, you know.
I am aware of that, but Sir Topham did tell us that he wanted to see you handling branch line trains.
Diesel knew he couldn't really argue with that. Then, a moment later, he realized exactly what an opportunity he had. He'd be able to demonstrate how diesels like him were better at branch line trains, too. In that case, I'd better get going. For the rest of the day, Diesel helped with the trains on the Farquhar branch, working as efficiently as he could. Although the trains ran on time, Diesel found himself puzzled by the way that things were being done. Some things were just slightly different to what he was used to, but other things left him quite puzzled indeed. Later that night, Diesel, Thomas, and Toby were resting in the sheds. So, what do you think of our branch line? Thomas asked, with a curious look at Diesel. Well, there are one or two things I don't quite understand.
What would those be?
Toby asked. Diesel thought back to his arrival on the Farquhar branch earlier that afternoon, and the train of quarry supplies he'd brought down with him. Well, the way that trains to the quarry are handled strikes me as highly inefficient. I mean, Toby is the only engine allowed to take them down.
I agree, but it's what we have to do,
Toby replied.
Yes, I had a run-in with a policeman a few years ago, and the Fat Controller had to bring Toby in. Apparently only engines with side plates and cow catchers are allowed to go down that line. It's the law.
Was this a new law? Diesel asked.
No, but it was a new policeman. I'd been going down that line for years.
I see what you mean, Diesel replied. From what he'd heard, it sounded like only one particular policeman had cared about that law. Early the next morning, Percy was shunting a goods train for Henry. The 3 mainline engines had told him about Duck's nicknames last night, and the little green engine was a bit puzzled. It didn't sound like something Duck would do. Sure, the Great Western engine was proud, but he wasn't malicious. You look bemused, Percy, Edward said, as he drew alongside.
It's this business with Duck, Edward. It doesn't seem right. I mean, it's not the type of thing Duck would do.
I agree, Percy, and so does the Fat Controller. Percy looked over hopefully.
He does?
Yes. The blue engine lowered his voice slightly. He's investigating this business, Percy. Those names had to come from somewhere.
I see,
Percy replied thoughtfully.
Anyway, I should get these trucks sorted.
Edward chuffed off to shunt his trucks, leaving a thoughtful Percy behind. The little green engine remembered how Duck had helped him when the big engines had been pushing him around.
I think I might do some investigating on my own,
Percy said to himself. He knew those names wouldn't have come from the trucks. Although name-calling wasn't unknown to them, it was the first time they'd blamed an engine for it. But although he wanted to help Duck, Percy wasn't quite sure where to start. About a quarter of an hour later, Percy was just arranging some trucks when James came steaming in.
There goes Rusty Red Scrap Iron,
Teased the trucks. An angry look crossed the red engine's face, and he wheeshed at them. But Percy realized not all of the trucks had been calling out that nickname, and that gave him an idea.
Driver, could I ask you to do something?
What do you have in mind, Percy?
Could you talk to the yardmaster and ask him to give us a list of all the trucks that were in the yard when the name-calling started?
I'll see what I can do, Percy's driver replied, and he climbed down from the little engine's cab. A few hours later, Diesel was heading along the Farquhar branch with a train of mining supplies. He knew his trucks would have to be shunted into the Farquhar yards for Toby to take down later on. He slowed slightly to take the points into the yard, but to his surprise found himself going straight on. Diesel didn't know that the yardmaster had forgot to set the points for him, following an earlier train up from the quarry. They must mean for us to go straight through to the quarry, Diesel said. He knew he really should have stopped and checked with the yardmaster. But, he thought, this would give him a chance to show those steam engines how efficiently this branch line could really be run. As he approached the curve next to the road, he spotted a uniformed figure standing next to the tracks. "Hey you! Stop!" Diesel did so, and the policeman looked him over disapprovingly. "What's all this then? No slide plates or cow catchers?" Diesel paused for a moment before replying. He couldn't afford to get into trouble. He might get sent away. Then he wouldn't be able to demonstrate his efficiency. "I'm sorry, officer," Diesel replied. "I didn't know those were needed." The policeman made a note in his notebook. "Ignorance of the law is no excuse. I shall have to talk to your controller." Meanwhile, Thomas had arrived at the main yard with the goods train. He smiled as he came alongside Percy, but before he could speak, Gordon chuffed through on his way to the coach yard. Why aren't you running fast, galloping sausage? Teased the trucks. Thomas glanced over, amused and confused.
What's that all about?
It's why Duck was sent away. The trucks say that he made up these nicknames about the engines.
Thomas frowned.
That's nonsense.
I know, Thomas. That's why I'm doing some investigating. Do you see that bad order track over there?
Percy asked. He was referring to the siding used to store trucks in need of minor repair, until they could be made to run again. Usually only 2 or 3 trucks occupied that siding, but now it was about half full.
You've got a lot of bad order trucks there,
Thomas observed.
Driver got a list of the trucks who were in the yard when the name-calling started.
That's them, is it?
The empty ones, yes. After all, we can't delay any loads, can we?
Certainly not, Percy, said a familiar voice. Both tank engines looked down to see the Fat Controller standing next to the tracks. He smiled approvingly at Percy. Percy, that is excellent thinking. You're a really useful engine indeed, showing such initiative.
Thank you, sir,
Percy replied modestly. Having those trucks separated is exactly what I needed, the Fat Controller continued. He turned to go and talk to the trucks, but was interrupted as the yardmaster came running up.
Excuse me, sir, he said, but I've just had a message from Farquhar. Diesel's in trouble with the police.
Bother! Exclaimed the Fat Controller. He glanced at his watch. Ask the station master at Farquhar to hold Toby until I get there.
Yes, sir,
replied the yardmaster. The Fat Controller then turned to Percy. Percy, keep up the good work. With that, he departed. Percy watched him go, then looked over at Thomas.
It would be good if we could give him some facts when he gets back,
he said thoughtfully. Thomas glanced over at his friend. He knew that tone of voice.
What do you have in mind, Percy?
It's something my fireman told me about from one of his detective shows. He calls it good cop, bad cop.
How does it work?
Percy quickly explained his plan.
It sounds like it could work,
Thomas said, when his friend had finished.
Unfortunately, we'll need another one of the trucks on that list. I think a couple are due to arrive on James's slow goods shortly.
Well, I'm not due to return to Farquhar for a few hours. I'll lend you a buffer with the yard work until then.
A short while later, on the Farquhar branch, Toby reached Diesel's waiting train. Once the tram engine had stopped, the Fat Controller climbed down from Toby's cab. He'd had to leave his car at Farquhar station, owing to the rough nature of the dirt road. He quickly strode up to the police officer. Is there a problem, Constable? I'm afraid so, Sir Topham. As you may recall, one of your engines was charged a few years ago for going down this line without side plates or cow catchers. This engine here says he didn't know about that law, but ignorance of the law is no excuse. That's quite right, Constable, but there is something I must point out. What would that be, sir? I checked with our lawyers before coming down here. It seems that legislation was repealed 6 months ago. The policeman looked closely at the Fat Controller. I'll have to check on that, back at the station. I'll be in contact after that, Sir Topham, replied the policeman. He climbed on his bicycle and rode away. The Fat Controller turned to Diesel. You've had a close shave, Diesel. Now you better get those trucks down to the quarry. Yes, sir, Diesel replied, and he sidled off. The Fat Controller returned to Toby. He was about to climb into the brown engine's cab when he noticed the expression on the tram engine's face. Is something wrong, Toby? He asked. Toby glanced over the Fat Controller's shoulder at the departing Diesel. Well, it's a very serious accusation to make, sir. Go on, Toby, encouraged the Fat Controller. I don't think Diesel was being completely honest with that policeman, sir. The Fat Controller's eyes narrowed. How do you mean, Toby? He asked. Well, sir, last night we were talking about Thomas's encounter with the law in the shed.
But that policeman said Diesel told him he didn't know anything about it.
That's interesting, Toby. Very interesting indeed. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. Without another word, the Fat Controller climbed into Toby's cab, and the tram engine headed back towards Farquhar. Back at the yard, Thomas and Percy were ready to put their plan into action.
Who told you those names?
Percy asked, as he shunted one of the trucks.
We told you. Duck came up with them. That's not what I asked. I asked who told you. Wouldn't you like to know?
An angry look crossed Percy's face. He bumped the truck hard into the others.
Oof, oof,
grunted the trucks. Percy headed off to fetch some more trucks. A few moments later, Thomas shunted another cut of trucks into the siding next to the bad order track.
I hope Percy didn't bump you too hard,
he said sympathetically.
We've had worse,
replied one of the other trucks.
He's just a little bit upset. You see, we don't think Duck made up those names. We suspect somebody may have used you to trick the other engines.
An indignant murmuring started amongst the trucks. They didn't like the idea of being used like that.
You know, Thomas continued, if you tell me the answer to Percy's question, I can see to it that he won't bump you again.
The trucks fell silent for a moment. While they were always eager to bump an engine, they weren't that keen about being on the receiving end. After a few seconds, a nearby brake van spoke up. It was that small, oily engine, he said.
That's right,
put in another truck.
It was Diesel. He said that Duck had told him those names.
All of them?
Yes, all of them, the brake van replied. A grin crossed Thomas's face as his driver finished uncoupling him.
Thank you, trucks,
he said, and he steamed off. As he headed for the sheds, for a rest and a drink, he whistled twice to Percy.
They heard those names from Diesel,
he called. Percy grinned. Now, all he had to do was get that information to the Fat Controller. When Toby and the Fat Controller returned to Farquhar Station, they found the station master waiting for them.
Excuse me, sir, he said, but there are a couple of messages for you.
What are they? The Fat Controller asked.
The first one was from the yardmaster at Knapford, on behalf of Thomas and Percy. It says, the trucks heard about those names from Diesel.
The Fat Controller frowned. I see, he said. You said there was another message?
This one's just come in, sir. Duck's run into a barber shop while trying to stop some runaway trucks.
A concerned look crossed the Fat Controller's face. Was anybody hurt?
I understand they were more surprised than injured, sir.
Has the breakdown train been sent up?
Thomas was in the sheds when the call came in. He's taken it up.
Good, replied the Fat Controller. With that under control, he'd have time to deal with Diesel here. Sure enough, the Fat Controller was waiting when Diesel returned with a train of loaded stone trucks. Diesel, I've been informed that those names for the big engines came from you, not Duck. But, sir, I heard them from Duck, Diesel said. It was too late for him to come clean now. I don't know if I can trust you, Diesel. I know you lied to that policeman. Toby and Thomas told you about the previous run-in with the law, last night. An angry look crossed Diesel's face. That stupid garden shed, he exclaimed, realizing who'd told the Fat Controller. I know Duck wouldn't make up names like that. He's very proud, proper, and professional. But you've shown yourself to be dishonest, Diesel, and we've only your word for it that those names came from Duck. What do you have to say for yourself? Diesel didn't reply. He knew the game was up. I thought so. Such behavior isn't just unacceptable, Diesel. It's disgraceful. Leave this train here. I want you off my railway. Now. But, sir, Duck... I don't care about your reasons, Diesel. Leave! Diesel's driver quickly uncoupled him, and Diesel departed. As he headed down the line, he wondered what the other Diesels would say when they found out what had happened. And so I was sent back to the other railway, Diesel finished. Silence had fallen over the sheds, while the other engines had listened to Diesel's story. Bear was the first to break the silence.
And yet here you are, working amongst these inefficient steam engines.
Yes, well, there's a story to that, too.
I should hope so. After what you did, I'm surprised Sir Topham brought you back here.
Well, in 1981, I saw one of my brothers being cut up for scrap. It made me realize that I was now as out of date as I had once considered steam engines, and that I wasn't really that superior after all. With that in mind, I volunteered for a major construction project here on the island. I told Sir Topham what was going on, and he agreed to give me a second chance. James looked over suspiciously.
Pardon me for saying this, Diesel, but I find your change of heart a bit hard to believe.
Well, he is telling the truth, Gordon said, surprising the other engines.
What do you mean, Gordon?
Diesel told Duck and I about this, after he stopped me running away with the Yuletide Express later that year. I asked my driver to confirm it.
The Class 8s were being withdrawn around that time,
Alice put in. As a preserved engine running railfan tours on the other railway, she'd seen most of the changes that had been taking place there. Yes, indeed. Although I understand that a few of my brothers have been preserved. Diesel paused for a moment. Henry, James, and Gordon. I apologize for tricking you all those years ago, and for making up those names. The three engines exchanged a look. This was the last thing they'd expected from Diesel, but he did seem sincere.
Apology accepted, Diesel,
James said. Yes, Henry agreed. But may I ask what brought this on? It's funny you should ask that, Henry. Do you remember when I went on strike earlier this year? You tried to warn me about what had happened when you, James, and Gordon tried something similar. I had a bit of time to think in the sheds, and I realized that you had been looking out for me. After that realization, I didn't really feel like an outsider anymore. None of the engines spoke for a moment, as Diesel's words sunk in.
Now that I think about it, I think I owe someone an apology too. Bear, I'm sorry if I misjudged you and was rude towards you.
Thank you, James,
Bear replied. After hearing Diesel's story, he understood why the Red Engine had been so hostile towards him, but he was glad to see that Diesel was repairing the damage he had done.